What if China attacks Taiwan right now? While we are all focused and have our eyes turned to the ongoing war and illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia, it's easy to forget the other conflicts that were currently ongoing prior to the beginning of Putin's actions. To answer our main question, let's take a look at the history of the relationship between China and Taiwan first. Starting in 1949, Mao Zedong's communists took power in Beijing in October by defeating Chiang Kai-shek's KMT nationalists in a civil war. This led to the KMT fleeing to the island of Taiwan to form their own government in Taipei in December, and while doing this, they cut off all contacts with mainland China. In 1950, while the conflicts between North and South Korea escalated into a full-scale war, and in terms of the Cold War era, the United States began to intervene and sent a fleet into the Taiwan Strait to prevent hostilities between Taiwan and mainland China. This showed the beginning of a sort of allyship between the US and Taiwan. At this point in time, Japan was formally renouncing all of its rights, claims, and titles to Taiwan, and this led to confusion over whom sovereignty over the island should be transferred to. Part of this is because it wasn't listed on the treaty, and the other part is because the US and the UK were on opposing sides of whether the Republic of China or the People's Republic of China was the legitimate government of China. Flash forward to 1971 and we see Beijing taking over China's seat at the United Nations, which was previously held by Taipei. So, now we are at the one-party principle. Basically, in the most simple way of explaining it, this is the idea that both the PCR and the ROC agree that mainland China and Taiwan have one government, that they are one country, but they can't agree on who that government is. So this fight isn't necessarily like the Russia-Ukraine situation where Russia thinks Ukraine is a part of it and Ukraine is like, no, we're clearly our own country. This is the deal of everyone's in the same boat, that it's all China, they just can't agree how it should be run in terms of the government. Then, however, we have the introduction of the Democratic Progressive Party, which is like the Russia-Ukraine situation, in which it completely rejects the one-party principle, and it's the idea that Taiwan is in fact an independent and sovereign country. In 1987, there was a brief period of time where it appeared as though the relationship between the mainland and the island were getting better, and for the first time in a long time, Taiwan residents were allowed to visit the mainland, which allowed families to reunite, and it ended in a boom or a surge in trade. And in 1991, things seemed to be on a great path as Taiwan lifted the emergency rule that turned into the end of the state of war with China. Just 2 years later, the first direct talks between the two sides occurred, and everything appeared like it was on a good path, but things quickly changed in 1995, and that's where things really heat up. Things really go awry when the Taiwanese president asks for a visa to visit the US. This leads to Beijing suspending the talks that were ongoing in a sort of protest of this United States allyship that is clearly on display. China didn't only suspend the talks, however, they decided to go a step further. Taiwan was now holding its first democratic election, which is of course to the dismay of China, who believes in this one China principle, but in 1996, China began testing missiles off Taiwan to deter voters in the election. China very publicly began to run combat exercises that appeared eerily similar to what preparations would be like in order to prepare for the 130-kilometer journey to the island. Maybe this was for intimidation, maybe this was preparation for an invasion, but it's not quite clear because the United States came to intervene before we could find out. At this point in time, the president of the United States was Bill Clinton, and he sent a ton of military reinforcement over to Taiwan. China was viewing Taiwan as a sort of rebellious place rather than an independent country, and was basically at this point trying to bully or frighten them back, but once the US intervened, China backed down, and the United States reasserted itself as a powerhouse people weren't prepared to stand up against. From here, it seemed as though China and Taiwan relations improved, or at the very least didn't deteriorate. In 2000, the KMT lost power in Taiwan, trade between the island and the mainland improved by both sea and air, and in both 2005 and 2008, important talks between the two continued on. In 2010, they signed a sweeping economic cooperation framework agreement, and in 2014, they held the first government-to-government talks since the separation. 2015 was shocking to many as it saw the leaders of both sides meeting in Singapore, shaking hands and waving enthusiastically to a large press group, and although things looked great, they didn't yet release any sort of joint statement. Things all took a turn for the worse in January of 2016 when Tsai Ing-wen from the Democratic Progressive Party won the election and officially became Taiwan's first female president. In her victory speech, she said, quote, "We will work towards maintaining the status quo for peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait in order to bring the greatest benefits and well-being to the Taiwanese people." But on the day of her inauguration, China warned that should she make any moves to formally break away, that peace talks would then become, quote, "impossible." China only grew more frustrated after the new government refused to acknowledge or agree with the One China principle, which led to them suspending all communications with the island. In December of 2016, then US President Donald Trump ended up speaking directly with the Taiwan president by phone, which was something that hadn't happened in decades due to the US diplomatic policy. In 2017, he and his administration approved $1.4 billion worth of arms sales to Taiwan, which might have just been the tipping point. In September of 2018, the US State Department approved the sale to Taiwan of spare parts for F-16 fighter jets and other military aircraft worth up to $330 million, which drew a warning from China that the move would jeopardize cooperation between China and the United States. This brings us to now. China is now back to the same sort of antics that were happening when they were flexing their military powers in 1995. Now, this time they're flying military aircrafts into Taiwan's airspace, or this air border known as Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ. And this is the location where you're supposed to identify yourself, or else the country is of course going to assume that you're there to attack them. China has begun flying these military aircrafts through the zone without identifying themselves. And this isn't happening just like one time or 5 times, it's happening dozens of times every single day. In the first week of October last year in 2021, while China was celebrating their founding, they also had a major spike in the amount of aircrafts they sent over to Taiwan. This of course led to the United States intervening and sending some military ships through the Taiwan Strait, accompanied by a Canadian ship, but here's the thing. China has grown a significant amount since 1995, and this time, it didn't feel too intimidated by the US, and the flights continued. And China's desire to reunite Taiwan with the mainland country is higher than ever. This brings us to what would happen if China really were to invade Taiwan. The fear over this is only growing, especially because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict we see going on currently. Unfortunately, because of the size difference and the difference in military capabilities, the amount of life lost in Taiwan, should China choose to invade, would likely be catastrophic. I'm on board with the idea of one life being too many, but we are talking numbers that I don't even want to think about. I don't believe that this is China's goal, it is just an unfortunately likely outcome of a war between these two neighboring countries. Here's the thing that contradicts that, however. While China massively outweighs Taiwan in terms of weapons and military personnel, not to mention how China spends 25 times the amount Taiwan does on their military, Taiwan has a defense pact with the US that dates back to the 1954 Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty, which means that the US could be drawn into the conflict. It is said that should an invasion by China occur, it would likely start electronically and in the cyber world. Taiwan's financial systems would be targeted, as well as key infrastructure, but also so would United States satellites, which would end up reducing the notice of launch ballistic missiles. Taiwan is obviously an island, so it's likely that China could target important supply chain ships that are on their way to the island with vital supplies like food. Airstrikes would be sent and would likely target some of the top political leaders, especially since they are so vocally and directly opposed to the One China ideology. Warships and submarines would traverse through the Taiwan Strait looking for the best area of coastline to target, looking for weaknesses in the defensive line, and with a goal in mind to capture certain areas and buildings. China is of course likely looking at the United States and the response to the Ukraine invasion to see, but this situation is different than that. While the US has placed sanctions and that sort of thing on Russia, they have yet to become directly involved in the conflict, but there's actually a reason for that. Taiwan is different because of this treaty they have. It is possible that the US might have an obligation to defend Taiwan, and that's where things get even more terrifying. China and the US are both nuclear powerhouses in the world, and who's to say what would happen should the United States get directly involved in this war, should it occur. At this point in time, all we can do is wait and hope that this doesn't occur, because it would very much end in devastation and there would be a huge loss of life. There is potential that, should China invade Taiwan, it will eventually somehow turn into a world war, especially if the US gets involved, and there is the threat of nuclear warfare. That is something that could devastate our entire world, and it truly is a threat to everyone, everywhere.